This is Glenn Fulshire with another issue of Language Testing Bytes. Welcome to issue 30 of Language Testing Bytes. In volume 36.3 of the journal, Bart Deygers and Margaret Malone published a paper with the kind of title that immediately demands that we read with care. It is Language Assessment Literacy in University Admissions Policies, or the Dialogue That Isn't. Given that language testing for admission to higher education is probably one of the largest volume language assessment activities in the world, and also one of the most lucrative, it's strange that more research hasn't been conducted into admission policies and the use of test scores. So this contribution to the literature is most welcome, and we're delighted that Bart has agreed to further contribute to the debate through participating in Language Testing Bytes.
Thank you, Glenn, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here on Language Testing Bytes to be able to talk about this study.
Bart, your paper is about language assessment literacy. Recently, it seems that this new field of research has grown exponentially. So, first of all, before we turn to your research specifically, perhaps you could explain for listeners who haven't come across this before just what language assessment literacy is and why it's now considered to be so important.
So what is language assessment literacy? I think language assessment literacy refers to the idea that people who use tests or test scores professionally, but who are not language testers, are able to use and understand those aspects of language testing that they need to perform their job responsibly. For example, a university admission officer, you would expect somebody who is responsible for international students and to ensure that these international students meet the language requirements that they're supposed to meet. You would expect those people to understand what, for example, an IELTS or a TOEFL score exactly means and how these two scores may relate to each other or different from each other. Now, why is language assessment literacy important? I think it is important in a very fundamental way. If we can't be sure that the people who use test scores know how to use them and know how to interpret them, there is no way that we can ensure valid score use and fair score use. So I think it is quite fundamental that people who interpret test scores are aware of what their limitations are, or aware of what the exact meaning of a test score is. Currently, there's a lot of attention going to validity, argument-based validity, also to fairness and justice. And I think that's why language assessment literacy is quite a hot topic in language assessment now.
You point out we need to develop approaches to language assessment literacy for a wide variety of stakeholders. Tell us who you are concerned with in your research and why you think it's essential to engage with this group of people.
I think of all of the fields within applied linguistics, language testing is arguably the most societally embedded one. Because everything we do, everything we create or research has a societal impact or is embedded in society. Typically, a language test has some kind of societal power. It opens doors or it closes doors for certain people, unfortunately. But I think that we need to talk to as many stakeholders as possible in society to make sure that our tests are understood and used correctly. Personally, in my research, I think it is essential to engage with the people who make policy, who make decisions. In my doctoral research, I primarily focused on people who make policy at university level, and people who determine the university admission policy at the national level. So rather than talk to the people who enact policy, who register students, I focused on the people who determine the policy that should then be enacted on both the national and the institutional level. I think it is important to talk to them because we need to understand how policy gets made, how policymakers think, and what policymakers consider relevant and irrelevant. If we want to have an impact on policy, we need to ask the right questions, and we need to ask questions that are of relevance to policymakers. If not, our field can easily be dismissed or disregarded.
So let's now turn to your paper with its catchy title. You set up the problem in the title as well as in the abstract to draw the reader in. So in a nutshell, would you like to explain the problem you address in your paper? What is the dialogue that isn't?
Now, in the early days of language assessment literacy, I think there was no real dialogue. It was rather top down. Language testers would draw up little lists of what stakeholders or score users would need to be able to know and do before they could actually engage in a language test professionally. And then later, more recently, language testers have started opening up more, have begun talking to score users to see what their actual needs were. But I think we need to take it one step further. And I think we actually need to focus not that much on language assessment literacy, but more so probably even on our policy literacy. Because I think if we as researchers or if language testers know more about how policy works and how policymakers think, what they need to come up with adequate decisions or policy plans, if we understood that, I think that the conversation between language testers and policymakers would run more smoothly. But just expecting language assessment literacy from people who are not professionally engaged primarily with language tests, I'm not sure how realistic that is. So I think we need to make the effort to make the dialogue work rather than stating that stakeholders need to make the effort to understand what language testing is all about.
You tackle this problem in relation to the policy context of Flanders in Belgium. Can you briefly explain this context for us?
My research typically takes place in Flanders, which is the officially monolingual northern part of Belgium. And the advantage is that it's small, so it's not that hard to conduct research on all universities, which is what we did in this study. We only have five main or five actual universities, so it is possible to actually talk to all policymakers. Now, the way university admission works in Belgium is that basically any Flemish person, any person who has attended primary or secondary school in Flanders, is able to register for university. That doesn't go for the international students who need to meet certain language requirements. They need to have typically a B2 level on the Common European Framework, and they can prove that they have a B2 level by taking a language test or by, for example, showing that they have attended secondary or primary school in Belgium. Now, the government sets the general requirement that international students need to demonstrate that they have a working knowledge of Dutch. But it is up to the universities to decide how they choose to fill that in and which criteria that they choose to implement. The main thing that the government is concerned with is setting language quota for Flanders. That would mean that bachelor years of university training, basically all of the classes need to be in Dutch.
Your research questions for the study you report in your paper are very clear. The first, and I guess the most important, is how university admission policy is made at both governmental and university level. The second concerns how policy effectiveness is monitored and the rationale behind the entrance requirements. Now, can you talk us through the methodology that you used and what data you collected to address these two questions? I'd be particularly interested to hear about the participants and how you managed to recruit senior policymakers.
It was actually quite simple. It wasn't that elaborate or extravagant. We would just meet up with high-level university policymakers or the policymakers at government level and really just literally go through the registration criteria, ask them why would you have this requirement, what was the assumption behind this language requirement, etc., etc. Now, how did we recruit senior policymakers? I think there's a couple of things that you need. First of all, you need patience and you need the ability to nag a lot. And it helps to have a network. These people, policymakers, they're typically very busy people. They're not easy to get to. Two things that really helped me, or rather three things that really helped me was once you have one big fish it is very easy to get smaller ones. For example, once you get a senior policymaker at a major university to talk, it is much easier to get the other universities on board. If you can say, well, people from University X have already talked to us, it would be a shame if you from your university were not included in this study. Sometimes you need to take a side route. For example, a recent study we did in Australia with high-level policymakers at the Home Office. It was impossible to get to them directly, so we actually went via the Belgian embassy and took a diplomatic route, and we found access to the policymakers via the Belgian embassy. But I think the main thing really to get access to high-level policymakers is to make it interesting for them. If you approach them by mentioning your academic research questions, that your academic output, etc., that doesn't really mean much to them. They can't really use that in their day-to-day practice. But if you have something for them that is interesting for them, it will be much easier to get a meeting. So I approached the university policymakers with information. Like, I have information that could make your university admission policy more efficient. I could offer you information that means that you have fewer false negatives, fewer false positives, that you have a smoother and a more efficient registration process, stuff like that. And then it wasn't really that hard to get them interested. So also the second part of every interview was actually just me talking with the policymakers about empirical findings, about them helping to improve their policy. So I think those three things are important to get access to senior policymakers.
Recruiting policymakers has always seemed just so difficult for language testers, so this is really interesting. Now, moving on to your findings, can you summarise your findings first for how policy is made at government and institutional levels, how they are similar and where they differ?
I think what is true for policy at all levels is that it is messy. Of course, in policy, there are a lot of different dynamics to consider, to juggle with. Empirical research only has minor influence, I must say. I met with government policymakers who said, well, it's not because research will show something that we will inevitably act upon those research results, because those research results would need to be reconciled with, for example, budget concerns, with institutional politics, but also with national and international politics, with what other institutions do, with how the media is reporting at a certain point in time, but also with ideology, with fault beliefs, and then with a number of uncontrollable random variables. So the policy making is a very, very complicated, complex business, and policymakers, and I do understand it actually more than I did in the past. I do understand that they sometimes do not have the luxury to simply focus on research results. That is a luxury that we as researchers have more than policymakers have. About similarities and differences, well, we found that at the government level, politics, of course, play a more important role than at the institutional level. But of course, institutional politics also play a role. That would be, for example, power dynamics between different powerful departments at a university that could influence and impact policy. Budget concerns at a university could definitely impact policy. There have been numerous examples of universities, not just in Flanders, but really all around the world, changing language requirements for budget needs. For example, lowering them if they want more international students, or increasing them if they want fewer.
That's fascinating. And what about the monitoring and rationales?
Yeah, I think I touched upon this already. The monitoring and the rationales to a policy are not really that clear or clean as you would read in much of the policy analysis literature. Traditional policy analysis theory from the 1950s and 60s, based on people like Laswell, they would say that policy making is a cycle, right? And so you would start from a perceived problem, consider a solution, think of a policy to implement that solution, and then regularly monitor if your policy actually helps results to solve the problem that you perceived in the first place. We found that this monitoring does not really occur that much. When policymakers will be notified of a problem, when there is a complaint, or when there is an official question to revise a certain policy or a request to revise a certain policy, then sometimes a policy will be revised. But again, if it is financially and politically feasible to revise it, then it will be revised, but not necessarily, again, based on empirical data.
Perhaps the things that will jump out of this for listeners are, firstly, the finding that policymakers are not really influenced by evidence-based research, but are driven by political or financial expediency. And secondly, that there is little or no monitoring of the effectiveness of policy. In the section on limitations, you say that this is a study in one small region of Europe, but it strikes true of many other countries as well. So the final question is really about language assessment literacy for these policymakers. What do we have to understand to reach them? And what kind of language assessment literacy do they need to better inform policy making?
Well, I think, as I said, we need to understand the work of a policymaker if we want our work to have an impact. I'm not saying that everything we do in language testing needs to be motivated from the perspective of a policymaker, but I think it makes sense that if we want our research results and our studies to impact policy, that we need to ask ourselves what policymakers care about. And I found that it's not that difficult to reach policymakers and to talk with them, to enter a dialogue, as soon as you accept that their paradigm is very different from the paradigm of a researcher, that they have quite a few different interests to reconcile. I think simply expecting policymakers to implement research findings is rather naive, perhaps even, because of these different paradigms that policy and research operate under. Policy is a game of budget, of power, of compromise, and research is a very, very different thing altogether. I don't think it's enough. For certain professions, it could definitely be, for example, for language teachers or people who are directly involved in creating language tests. I think, yes, definitely, language assessment literacy is something that we should aim for, that we should include in the curriculum, that we should regularly return to with in-service teachers. But when it concerns policymakers or senior score users, I think that we need to make sure that we ask the right questions that they are interested in. And this does not mean selling out at all, because sometimes you will find that many of the questions that policymakers are concerned with are also the questions that we ask ourselves. The study that I'm involved in now is a 3-year study of the impact of language requirements for migrants on people who haven't had a chance to attend education. And the first thing I did in this research project was to determine research questions together with the policymakers, to ensure that what they wanted to know would be part of the research design. And just stuff like this makes it much easier to enter a dialogue, because you have a shared goal, you have a shared understanding of what you want to find out. And then it becomes much easier to actually get traction with these people. And I think the language assessment literacy, then, it just finds its way into the conversation. It comes rather naturally. I think imposing knowledge and skills concerning language testing, I don't think it has worked. I don't think it will ever work. And what I do think is what we need is a proper dialogue.
This has been a really interesting discussion, and I'm sure that it will ring true for so many readers of your paper and listeners to this podcast. It's bound to spark much more research into the interface between language assessment literacy and policy, which for too long has been shrouded in mystery. Thanks for your contribution to the demystification process through this podcast.
Thank you, Glenn. It's been a real pleasure to participate. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bytes. Language Testing Bytes is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bytes through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bytes.